Hello, greetings from Singapore. My name is Marco Raska. I am an assistant professor at the S. Rajaratnam School of International Studies, and where I also had a small program called Military Transformations. In 2019, the RSIS, in collaboration with the Norwegian Institute of Defense Studies and the Institute for Securities Policy in Kiel, in Germany, at Kiel University, organized a workshop on the impact of Fourth Industrial Revolution and military innovation. And the papers presented at the workshop have been subsequently revised, sharpened, and eventually submitted to one of the leading journals in the field of strategic and security studies, the Journal of Strategic Studies. Last month, the special issue was published, and I'm pleased to welcome the two main editors of the JSS we have today, who are both of us with us today, Professor Joe Maiolo and Professor Tom Mankin. Prof. Maiolo is a historian of international politics at the King's College London, specializing in the origins of great wars, arms races, and intelligence in the 20th century. He is the editor of the Journal of Strategic Studies and a member of editorial board of Intelligence and National Security and a fellow of Royal Historical Society. Thomas Mankin is the president and chief executive of the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Assessments in Washington, D.C. He's a senior research fellow at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University. And he has a long distinguished career in the government, military, and academia. Prof. Mankin's work on military innovation and diffusion has also inspired many students, including me, to delve into the rare and mysterious field of military innovation studies. So tonight we will start with Prof. Maiolo's welcoming remarks, followed by 4 select presentations from the special issue, and then we will have discussion, including questions and from the audience, which can be done through the online chat function on your Zoom screen. I hope that today's panel will connect experts around the world interested increasingly in the topic of emerging technologies in warfare. So without further ado, please welcome Professor Joe Maiolo.
Thank you, Michael. Well, welcome everyone to this roundtable discussion of the JSS special issue on defense innovation and the Fourth Industrial Revolution. I've been invited to, first of all, I'd like to thank the organizers certainly for organizing this roundtable. So it's a great pleasure to be able to, for Tom and I to be able to organize a public event like this for a special issue. I've been invited to just say a few words about the Journal of Strategic Studies, which was founded in 1978 by Professor John Gooch and Professor Amos Perlmutter, who specialized in civil military relations. They were encouraged by the journal's first publisher, Frank Cass, to put together a new journal in the field. And well, we're very grateful that they did, because so much great work has been published since 1978 in the Journal of Strategic Studies. It's now a title with the Taylor Francis Routledge Group, and a defining feature of the journal, and what I think remains is really quite distinctive feature amongst peer-reviewed academic journals, is its focus and commitment to the multidisciplinary study of war and military operations. Our mantra is that we publish a theoretically informed history and historically informed political science or social science, and we stick to that commitment. And we also see ourselves very much at the intersection between scholarship and practice. And if you have the opportunity to look through our titles and our pages and our contributors, you'll see very much that we draw on a wide range of authors that cut across think tanks, obviously academic institutions, and of course, practitioners. We publish 7 times a year, so 7 issues a year, and usually annually we publish 1 or 2 special issues. And in recent years, we've had special issues on French military operations in Africa, military transformation in China, and last December we had another special issue on NATO at 70 that looked at the historical and theoretical foundations of NATO. And of course, today we're here to celebrate and discuss our latest special issue on Fourth Industrial Revolution technologies and military innovation. And I'd like to take this opportunity on behalf of Tom and I to thank the organizers of the special issue and the contributors for really putting together a fantastic issue. It sits wonderfully in exactly where our sweet spot in terms of our analytical focus is, in that intersection between military innovation, technology, and war. And so we're very grateful for the organizers for doing that, but also to putting together really quite a comprehensive special issue. If you have the opportunity to read the articles, and if you have a hard copy to flip through, you'll see that it's comprehensive in its coverage. It covers the United States, China, Russia, small powers, Israel, and also, I would also like to congratulate the organizers for putting together a really diverse and multi-generational team. So there are early career contributors to the issue, as well as senior and established scholars. And it's fantastic. And in a sense, I would say it, and I think Tom would agree with me, it represents really the up and coming generation of strategic studies scholars. So with that, let me turn the chair back to Michael, who will be giving us the first presentation in this roundtable. And so he'll be introducing his contribution and the special issue overall.
Thank you very much, Tom. Joe, let me share my screen for everyone. Hold on. Okay, there you go. All right, so to kick off, this topic on, emerging technologies for the Industrial Revolution and sort of implications of warfare, we have to start with some sort of a conceptual overview before delving into sort of empirical case studies. And what, my chapter, what I wanted to do is really to position the current Fourth Industrial Revolution wave into previous revolutions of military affairs, and sort of give a sort of historical overview and trying to figure it out, what is the continuity and change? Are we in a different era or not compared to the past? So basically, if you look at today's narrative on emerging technologies, everything seems to be disruptive. So you have novel emerging technologies, application of machine learning into algorithms, into warfare, promise to enable unprecedented capabilities concerning the speed of information data, automation, weapons platforms, surveillance systems. All the sort of gamut of emerging technologies seem to indicate we are, at the cusp of a sort of a new next defense transformation. But looking at the history, what is quite interesting is that we have been 4 decades in this disruptive mode. And each decade had this overarching promise that new technologies coupled with organizational and operational innovation will create a sort of this order of magnitude of military change. And this conceptual sort of timeline that you see here basically, started, as early as mid-1970s, so after the Yom Kippur War, where you see a lot of, starting to think about, a lot of thinking between, American and Soviet strategic thinkers about the impact of, precision-guided munitions and electronic warfare in combat. But interestingly, this whole disruptive narrative, this conceptual narrative, was actually being more reflected in the Soviet or Russian military technical revolution in the 1980s, which was sort of the first wave where the Soviet thinkers started to discuss the implications on scientific revolution and as well as on military innovation. But of course, back then the Soviet military thought was not able to implement. The Soviets were not able to implement that, and basically the whole country dissipated, right? But meanwhile, at the same time, you have, a small group of analysts in the United States who are monitoring the Soviets, right? And are basically trying to ascertain really what the Russians are writing about back then. And so in the early 1990s, we have that sort of early adaptation in the US strategic community to really trying to ascertain whether there is military technical revolution, what does that mean, you know, and what the impact may be. And at that sort of second wave, you know, the narrative changed into what we call the revolution in military affairs, where basically, you know, the Soviet MTR, which was more on the tactical level, focusing on tactical, you know, and technological tactical linkages. The Americans, strategic thinkers, put it at the operational level. So coupled with the operational concepts, organizational force structures, and technological change. And it was through this, you know, period that in the mid-90s, we were in a sort of what we call the RMA technophilia. In the mid-90s, really the disruptive narrative has really echoed basically the entire sort of Western, primarily or American strategic literature. And basically, it was this overarching promise that new technologies will create, you know, new advantages and will, you know, provide, you know, advantages that will take away, you know, the fog of war that Clausewitz talked about, the fog and friction of war. New technologies will be able to link everyone together, you know, so the capabilities bringing together online will basically be able to, you know, solve strategic problems. So in the mid-90s, we were suddenly in that technophilia, and that narrative, really that disruptive narrative, was very prevalent. Of course, that was not enough. So in the early 2000s, you know, that RMA narrative has morphed into even broader narrative, defense transformations, where everything was on the table, everything had to be, you know, rethought. And, you know, so it was not only the military, but it was a much broader sort of strategic transformation. But of course, what happened, it was the invasion of Iraq and war on terror for the next, you know, 20 years. And so the promise of emerging technologies in warfare have been, you know, sort of, you know, mitigated by these two conflicts. So by 2006, 2008, the whole disruptive narrative is waning down, and into this modernization plus wave, where basically there are a lot of skeptics and critical voices questioning the disruptive narrative, right? And then after, you know, a few years, I think we are sort of reviving that disruptive narrative through what I call sort of the AI-enabled revolution in military affairs. And so in my paper, I outline these, you know, 6 waves, if you will, and trying to, you know, understand what is the continuity and change. And what is really interesting, you know, is that the first 5 waves, if you will, were really dominated, you know, by the implementation in the U.S. And later sort of NATO countries, right? But their implementation of the ambitious promises, you know, none of the waves have been really implemented. And another factor that is also different is looking at the impetus, right? So when the, you know, Russians started, there was, you know, technological military innovation impetus, and which continued through the mid-90s, right? But in the current, you know, AI RMA wave is the strategic competition coupled with emerging technologies and civil military convergence that changes, you know, the impetus for it. So what is very interesting is also the lexicon. So each era had a very different operational concepts, very different, you know, priorities. But, you know, you can see, you know, the patterns of technological insertion and some sort of challenge on the opposing side and adaptation. And of course, the forms of warfare have evolved, but we are basically, you know, in a sort of cusp of sort of a new era, what I would call the automated warfare, you know, AI-enabled RMA. And the key question is really what is really different. And basically, in my paper, I make an argument for three points. One is really the strategic competition. So in the previous 5 waves, you know, the US and its ally countries had basically the monopoly of advanced military technologies. But over the last 2 decades, you know, the Chinese and Russians were able to catch up at that front very significantly. So China, and Elsa will talk about it, basically, you know, had made this huge leap from copier from 1990s copy reproducer into, you know, adapter modifier and basic of technologies. And basically the whole debate that is really going on right now is whether the Chinese and Russian AI RMAs will be able to match the American AI RMA. So you have multiple of actors, but it's not only, you know, these great powers. What is really interesting is that you have also small states and middle powers like Singapore, Israel, and others who are looking at the potential of these commercially driven emerging technologies and trying to understand their military potential. And when we talk about this AI-driven defense transformation or wave, or if you will, you see a lot of emphasis on AI. And, you know, that is a second sort of difference, right? So you have the commercially based innovation that inspires military to leverage their military potential. So back then in the first 5 RMA waves, it was mostly the primes of defense industrial primes who have had the monopoly over advanced, you know, platforms, weapons platforms, and technologies. But now the whole dynamic, of course, you know, has shifting, and most military organizations are trying to figure out how do we exploit that commercial innovation into the military arena, right? And of course, the military applications from AI seem to be endless, right? So depending on what type of data you can harness, and what type of algorithms you can put together, but the military utility of AI is basically touching basically everything in the military applications. So this is the second one. And the third one, what is different that I mentioned, is the opportunity of small states and middle powers like Singapore, Norway, Israel, and others who also have the potential to, you know, leverage these technologies and shape, you know, the diffusion. So that is sort of, you know, the path and pattern of the diffusions is very much different from the previous 5 RMA waves. So in summary, basically what has changed? You know, you have complexity of security environment, you have emerging technologies accelerating military change, and you know, what I just mentioned, you need to exploit emerging technologies from civil and military domains. But of course, there are, as in the past, there are many factors which have not changed. And here, the importance of human domain and warfare, in my view, becomes prevalent. So human decision-making and strategy and sort of the human element in warfare will become, you know, is equally important. What has not changed is also the need for interoperability between services, entities, and other platforms, you know. And what has not changed is also the resource capacity barriers for defense innovation. So those are certain elements that have not changed. So despite this disruptive narrative, right, you still have elements that are very much grounded in continuity. And of course, what should change, and that is the big question, you know, that many countries are figuring out: how do we revamp our organizational structures? So on one hand, you have all these emerging technologies. You have the age of Star Wars, where, you know, you can shoot down satellites through laser beams, right? But our organizational military structures are 200 years old, based on Napoleonic era. So how should defense ministries, governments change as a result of that? And of course, that is tied to military education. It's tied to strategic, professional, you know, training procedures and sort of the conceptual and organizational part. But of course, it's also about how to seek niche technological advantage through cooperation. So this is sort of a summary of my introductory paper that sort of brings forward, you know, the AI revolution in military affairs in conjunction, the historical continuity and discontinuity of the revolutions and military affairs.
Thank you, Michael. Sorry, I forgot to unmute myself. It's my great pleasure now to introduce a dear friend, Professor Katarzyna Zeisk from the Norwegian Institute for Defense Studies and the Norwegian Defense College.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Joe. And I'm really happy that we were able to meet here and have this discussion. So yes, my remarks are basically designed to present some of the key observations and arguments from my article, my contribution to the special issue on Russia's approach to defense innovation and for IR technologies. Can we get the slides, please? So first, next slide. Thank you. So I will talk first about the drivers and incentives that are pushing Russia or have been pushing Russia to systematically increase a focus on new and potentially disruptive technologies, especially since 2010. This has been a part of the large-scale Russian military modernization process that was launched in 2008. Then I will briefly present the major programs that Russia is pursuing and the model of defense innovation that Russia is trying to apply to foster innovation in the defense sector. And I'll also talk briefly about why Russia has not succeeded, why the grand ambitions do not match the reality yet, what are the limitations that Russia is facing. And finally, I will draw some implications and tentative conclusions from the findings. So I think the first thing to say is that technological prowess has traditionally been regarded in Russia as a critical element of military effectiveness and a strategic advantage. Next slide. And there have been a number, both pessimistic assessments of where this development of the technological development we are observing is going, and some also optimistic assumptions. So first, the Russian authorities seem certain that trends such as the fusion of autonomous and AI-enabled weapon system, convergence between human machine learning, cyber and AI, coupled with novel operational concepts, force structure, will influence the trajectory and character of future warfare and human involvement therein. And this, the reasoning goes, can create new vulnerabilities that Russia's enemies can take advantage of. And that's why this is one of the reasons why Russia absolutely has to embark on this development and create both solutions and new weapon systems and combined weapon systems in order to address that problem. Moreover, the development seems likely to Russia to affect the fundamental aspects of international security, such as deterrence, arms control, strategic balance, which has been very much at the core of the Russian foreign policies in the post-Cold War era. So gaining and losing ground in the contest for cutting-edge technology is therefore seen in Russia as likely having far-reaching consequences for the distribution of power in the international system, and of course for Russia's place in it. And next slide. President Putin basically sort of presented it in almost existential terms, and he's not alone actually to put it like that. He said that those who manage to ride this technological wave will surge far ahead, and those who will fail to do so will be submerged and drowned. And I think it's quite representative expression of the sort of dominant approach and perception of the development. But at the same time, there is also some form of optimism among the Russian decision makers that this new technology can actually be a historical opportunity for Russia to catch up with the weapons development in the West, especially after the decay of the past 2 decades, after the Cold War. And finally close the capability gap and importantly in a relatively short period of time. So next slide. The 4 IR programs that Russia is pursuing, they are quite similar to those we can observe in the United States. In China, they are usually smaller in scale and include, as you can see on the slide, the sort of basic 4 IR programs: AI, quantum computing, human machine, hybrid intelligence, autonomous weapon systems, AI-enabled unmanned system, nanotechnology, and also the so-called weapons based on new physical principles, which are directed energy, electromagnetic weapons, and other major programs. So The Russian approach to innovation is based on, the model of innovation is based on this traditional top-down, state-driven approach, although there are some important modifications which basically aim to take an advantage of the progress that is being made in the civilian sector, where many of the sought-after technologies are being developed. So Russia aims, therefore, it tries to foster this military-civil cooperation, and in this way maximize the access of the state to ideas, to talent, to expertise, and in this way to shorten the time between the generation of an idea and its full implementation. Next slide, please. Yes, so the basic approach relies on creating this sort of radical innovation centers, as they are called, technoparks, that are to become this generator of ideas and dual use technologies. One is ERA Technopolis, which was created in 2018. So the approach draws from this sort of Soviet tradition of Naukogrady, which is the science cities, but Russia also partly emulates the US military civilian sector cooperation, public-private business, academic research. And this model also resembles the Chinese model of military civil fusion, combining science and technology parks connected to campuses of large Chinese military universities. Next slide. The first of this sort of construct Russia created was in 2012. It was the flagship project, the Advanced Research Foundation, which was to be the predator within the field of 4IR, and it has been tasked to pursue civilian and dual-use programs. Example of these programs you can see on the slide. But in 2018, I mentioned already, ERA has been created. This is the military technopolis, which is specifically tasked to create technology for the use of the Russian armed forces. Next slide, please. And it is to cooperate closely with the Russian military industrial complex, but also with the civilian sector. And right now, there are more than 1,200 various entities involved in cooperation with ERA. Of course, top Russian arms manufacturers, Kalashnikov, Zvezdia, Sukhoi, and dozens of the largest Russian universities, research institutes which are connected to ERA. This includes also the largest interdisciplinary laboratory, the Kurchatov Institute, which, among others, hosts nuclear physics facilities, focuses on the next generation technologies. They have received a special role in directing research or helping to direct or lead research at ERA. Next slide. And as an example, you can see here, ERA has at this moment, and it's expanding, a cluster of 16 prioritized development fields. You can see here intelligence, robotics, of course, AI, small spacecrafts, energy sufficiency, pattern recognition, nanotechnology, bioengineering, etc. The scope of the programs is pretty significant. So the pace of the development of these various programs varies. Some are more advanced than others, but generally we can say that Russia lags behind its main competitors, the US and China, for a number of reasons. Next slide. So despite expressed grand ambitions, next slide, please, over the past decade, Russia struggles with leveraging a number of these programs. So there is a number of initiative structures that Russia is creating to foster the innovation in the military R&D. But the problem is, among others, lack of predictable resources, especially compared to the United States and China, low level of innovation and labor productivity across the Russian national economy, weak rule of law, deficient intellectual property rights. There are also worrying trends in the educational base that is no longer indicating that it's no longer the sort of foundation for a solid foundation for high-tech development. Of course, pervasive corruption, heavy-handed bureaucratic control, among others, other constraints that are hampering the development. Next slide. So given the set of circumstances, Russia appears an unlikely leader in 4I, global leader in 4IR technologies. To date, this development has not produced any fundamental change in the character of Russian warfare. The effort is expected from Russia to produce new types of weapon systems, but the pathway for now is rather of an incremental change in creating interconnected systems, combining advanced pre-IR technologies with features such as AI, autonomous systems, quantum computing. So the objectives basically is to amplify the capabilities and the key pillars of the Russian defense, deterrence, and coercive options. For instance, by, next slide, by applying unmanned vehicles for nuclear missions. Here you can see the known cases, the Poseidon drone, hypersonic weapons for non-nuclear deterrence, or AI-enabled system in grain zone operations. That's already what we've seen that Russia is trying to apply. And notably, however, we should say, Russia has demonstrated an ability to take risks and experiment and exploit the technological gains as they emerge. And I think it's a very important quality in this development. And it may, what Russia is creating may, even though Russia is not necessarily a global leader, it can still give Russia a sharpened edge on the battlefield, if not maybe at some point a critical advantage that the Russian authorities are ultimately pursuing. And finally, and next slide, this basically ends my presentation. We cannot exclude an occurrence of a disruptive technological breakthrough in Russia. But as Bob Porkstress argued, and also as it was clear in the presentation of Michael, this will not necessarily be enough to compete successfully on politically and militarily. And Russia and other stakeholders would need to find the right balance and relationship between, on the one hand, technology that is being developed on the one hand, and of course, doctrines, how it is actually adapted in doctrines, in concepts, and in the organizational praxis on the other. Thank you very much, Joe.
Thank you, Katarzyna. It's now my pleasure to introduce Elsa Kania, who is a senior, who is an adjunct fellow at the Center for New American Security and a PhD candidate in Harvard. And welcome, Elsa.
Thank you so much. And thank you to the editors and the organizers for the very kind invitation. I'm excited to be continuing the conversation on some very timely topics that are of both strategic and academic relevance. And I will share some thoughts based on my article, as well as some of the concerns that animate my ongoing analysis and academic research, including in support of my dissertation, and an attempt to sort of tie some of these trends and themes together and try to discuss in particular how the case of China may emerge as a really fascinating component of this overall evolving landscape of what may become a new revolution in military affairs. And I would echo and highlight the point raised by my previous panelists that this is maybe a distinct moment as the first RMA, so to speak, in which China may be a leading player and perhaps even pioneer in some of the technologies and concepts of operations that are emerging. And I'll speak today about some of this case of China in the context of some of the theories and literature. I'll outline a couple points from the sort of emergent strategic thinking of strategists and scientists from the Chinese People's Liberation Army, the PLA. Then I'll talk through some of the experimentation we're seeing in terms of concepts and technologies, and conclude by raising some of the challenges that China may still confront. And I think when we are talking about the idea of this new RMA, or perhaps an AI RMA, or it's striking to see the degree of enthusiasm with which Chinese leaders and strategists appear to have embraced these concepts. And I think that does reflect the fact that China has a tradition of closely studying foreign militaries and has been influenced to a striking degree at times by American and Russian concepts and antecedents. And I'd say that even while ideas around an RMA had fallen out of fashion in the United States, there's been a degree of consistency in how Chinese strategists have looked at the idea of such a revolution in military transformation from the 90s through the present. And these concepts in Chinese strategic thinking and writings around informatization as a style of warfare in which information technology and information operations have been critical to victory, and now the transition from informatization to intelligentization, or the idea of a stage of intelligent warfare and operations that is emerging with the advances in emerging technologies that we've seen discussed in the course of the panel. And both personally and professionally, I was drawn to start to focus on these issues upon moving to DC and hearing a lot of the US discourse around what was then the third offset strategy, some of the defense innovation initiatives launched in the 2014-2015 timeframe that received a lot of attention and enthusiasm and were intended to reinforce American military technological dominance, even supremacy. And my concern at the time was that these initiatives were provoking anxiety and quite a striking reaction from Chinese strategists who were looking at these same trends in international technological development, and also were concerned about rivalry between the United States, which has only intensified and become an ever more fraught dynamic in the years since. So often in the policy world, we've heard talk of a new era of great power competition. What I would argue, whether in this article or in my book forthcoming, is that this new era arguably started back in the 1990s when Chinese military strategists and defense planners were reacting to a series of events from US success in the Gulf War and the demonstration of American capabilities that the PLA could not match, but could seek to counter and develop asymmetric capabilities to target potential weaknesses in US networks and battle systems. And of course, the Taiwan Straits crises across the history of US-China relations have provided a motivation for China to develop capabilities for response, and can also look to moments of history occurring as the result of accident and coincidence, like the accidental bombing of the Chinese embassy in Belgrade in 1999, which provoked the launch of the 995 program, through which China aimed, in the words of Jiang Zemin at the time, to develop the capabilities about which the US might be most fearful, and to start to leverage disruptive technologies as a means to offset, so to speak, American advantages. So if we've seen attempts within the US military and defense community to actualize an offset starting around 2014, 2015, though the phrasing has since become less popular, I would argue we've seen a Chinese offset strategy that does date back to the 90s, and in which a new phase was launched around 2014, that August or so, when Xi Jinping convened a Politburo study session to discuss themes of military transformation and the existential imperative that is keen for China as well as for Russia, as we've heard, that as militaries that had been more backwards relative to the United States, that had seen a gap emerge in their capabilities relative to this powerful adversary, the euphemism by which the PLA often alludes to the US military, this moment of pivot or transition in the technologies and concepts of operations that would determine mechanisms of victory for future warfare, was a historical opportunity for China as well, especially because, unlike in the 90s, today China is starting closer to the same point as the US and other leading world-class militaries, given that the United States no longer has a monopoly on the technologies that would be critical to future styles of warfare. And in fact, the rise of Chinese innovation and Chinese technology companies that contend with their American counterparts at the frontiers of these new fields really start to change the game and offer new opportunities for China, as well as, of course, the challenges. And when we look at this from a historical and theoretical perspective, certainly sort of a robust tradition of the study of military emulation and the realist rationale for why militaries copy each other, as we are seeing among the US, China, and Russia today. I would also point to some of the ideas around creative insecurity from Taylor's work, for instance, that China as a state that sees very acute security threats and is anxious as a latecomer, as a military that has been backwards, even the legacy of the Century of Humiliation and the notion that China had missed the previous revolutions in industry and military technology, and therefore been subject to foreign predation. So I think a combination of insecurity and opportunity have really been critical drivers of the degree to which China has been willing to place big bets on future technologies despite the uncertainty. I think there is, while I think the role of strategic culture can be overemphasized, I do think that this attention to technology as of strategic importance and even an attitude of technological determinism also shapes the PLA's openness to embrace some of these disruptive technologies. And a quotation from Engels, and forgive me if this is German to Chinese to my English translation, but essentially that once a new technology emerges, it will inevitably be employed on the battlefield, whether commanders will it or not. So it's sort of this notion that the technologies we're seeing today will inevitably be employed in future military affairs, and perhaps in ways that may transcend current conventions or even preferences of military organizations. And I think that does segue to questions of how we see the role of bureaucracy and organization and features of China's defense innovation ecosystem that will influence its capacity to experiment and start to implement some of these new concepts and capabilities. And I would say we see distinct strengths and weaknesses in China's approach at this point in time. And I think in particular, China has been catching up pragmatically through all means available, including industrial espionage. But I think we're starting to see a transition to trying to build the capacity to undertake a frontier or cutting edge innovation, building up the talent, dedicating the resources, and creating programs where we can start to see more disruptive technology underway. And I'd point since the 2015 reforms to the PLA, to the creation of the Central Military Commission, Science and Technology Commission, which one might describe as a would-be DARPA, and that not necessarily a coincidence, given how closely China has studied DARPA and each and every DARPA program of relevance over the years. And I think the CMC SMTC has launched really since 2016 under the 13th five-year plan timeframe, a series of plans and programs funding emerging and disruptive technologies, focused on artificial intelligence prominently, as well as attention to biotechnology and its interdisciplinary applications, also of course concerned with quantum technology. And I think the willingness to have to start to reorient aspects of China's military system and structure to elevate the importance of innovation and leadership behind it has been significant. And some of the new plans and programs underway have started to dedicate more funding, placing bets, and also starting to bring into the ecosystem new companies, growing number of universities, as relates to the strategic objective and imperative of military civil fusion, as important for China to leverage its technology companies as it has seen the United States do in the past, and also out of a recognition that often the cutting edge innovation is emerging in industry and has to be captured and leveraged by the PLA today. So we can look at some of the particular programs and institutions. I find it significant, for instance, that the Academy of Military Sciences, once a more traditional institution responsible primarily for strategy and doctrine, has a current president who's an expert in supercomputing and artificial intelligence, as well as a vice president who's known for advocating military applications of biotechnology. So in terms of in terms of adaptation to Chinese bureaucracy and organizations, really placing technology and innovation at really a high level, and starting to create more institutes to promote defense innovation, recruiting younger scholars and scientists into the Academy of Military Science, among other key centers of gravity for these efforts. I think these are all indicators that while China's system is not quite as top-down or driven by Xi Jinping as People's Daily may seem to indicate, I think that there is enough of a centralization of leadership that when innovation and intelligentization are identified as top-level priorities, that does provide a powerful impetus for change, despite the uncertainty, as well as some of the risks that may come with betting on the future in this way. And I think we'll see going forward some of the capabilities already demonstrated taking shape as there already demonstrations of swarming, a great deal of exuberance about drones across every service of the Chinese military and within every domain. Seen a lot of interest in AI to enable ISR, whether that's AI-enabled satellites or improvements in data integration, such as in the undersea domain, and also a great deal of interest in decision support and how to enable future commanders to achieve decision superiority, such as they're starting to leverage AI in that role, inspired by DARPA programs of the past, like Deep Green, and having seen as well the potential implicit in AlphaGo as a strategist in a very simple war game to come up with tactics and stratagems that humans had not imagined in years upon thousands of years of playing the game. So I think we are a ways from seeing the realization of these ideas and capabilities. I think there is a lot of hype across each military that is starting to confront the reality of challenges of implementation and the practicalities of data, talent, infrastructure, and as well as questions of testing and reliability that may come into play with future systems that have growing degrees of autonomy or maybe unpredictable in their function for that reason. But I think this is a moment that is fascinating to be studying these topics, and I will very much look forward to your questions and to continuing the conversation today and going forward. Thank you again.
Thank you so much, Elsa. Now let's turn to Professor Ian Bowers from the Royal Danish Defence College, and I mentioned he'll be speaking about his contribution to the special issue. So welcome, Ian.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you to the organisers for putting this this event together. It's a real pleasure to speak here today. Just let me share my screen. So the article I'm talking about today was written with my excellent colleague Sarah Kirschberger from Kiel University, and essentially we sought to examine how disruptive innovations emerging from the 4IR will kind of impact the sharper end of naval operations. Now, writing any analysis like this is kind of challenging. You know, what any analyst needs to do is understand the kind of complex interaction between differing new and old technologies and how they are integrating into existing warfighting systems and strategic concepts and operational doctrines. And as one analyst writes, the kind of key to identifying important developments in the future is to concentrate on the synthesis of different technologies and how that synthesis can produce fundamental change in mission capabilities. And that's kind of what we tried to do. And this is even more, or arguably more, difficult in the naval realm, where we just don't have a lot of data about what, you know, warfighting looks like at sea, because there hasn't been one in a very, very long time. So to address this challenge, we used the idea of naval disruption and the disruptive effect of the 4IR technologies on the attainment of a core idea within naval operations, that of sea control. And what we did was we centered on two 4IR-enabled inputs to sea power, namely unmanned systems at sea and maritime domain awareness, and then the output, which is sea control. And then we contextualized it using two case studies, the Baltic and the South China Seas. And not to like preempt the presentation, but up front, what we found is that 4IR innovations at the moment may alter how navies conduct operations. For example, manned, unmanned balances will change, and navies might have a greater ability to detect and prosecute enemy assets. But the 4IR will not currently disrupt how navies seek to attain sea control. Instead, the integration of these technologies with existing capabilities and subsequent adjustments in doctrine and procedures will likely lead to sustaining or kind of incremental innovations or improvements in how navies go about achieving sea control. So I think the first thing we have to kind of talk about, because it's a word we've heard a lot today so far, is what is disruption? What do we mean when we talk about disruption in the first place? And kind of technological disruption was a concept first developed in the civilian world, and it was used to describe the impact of a kind of discontinuous innovative technology, and how that fundamentally altered how we measured success in a specific market. So, for example, the Walkman, when it was introduced, or maybe the iPhone for younger people, when that was introduced, that fundamentally changed how we understood the market in which it operated in. What we try to do then is put this into the naval realm, and on this slide here you saw a picture. The older warship is the Dreadnought, HMS Dreadnought, which fundamentally changed how navies thought about their own relative effectiveness by combining new engines, new weapons, new armor into one package. It kind of changed how we thought about what the most powerful warship on the sea was, and what other navies could do in relation to it. This was a disruptive innovation. In contrast, on the other picture is the USS Ford class. This is an extremely impressive carrier. It's the latest carrier from the United States Navy, but in essence, it is just a step up from the previous one. It doesn't really change anything in effect to how the US exercises sea power or the kind of balance of power at sea. And this is what we would describe as a kind of sustaining innovation. But ultimately, what we need to do is get the technology and put it together with kind of systemic or kind of infrastructural developments at the same time. So I think carrier aviation is a really good example of this kind of innovation. And in this case, we had new discontinuous technology. The aircraft was introduced, gradually became integrated into naval doctrine and structure. And then during World War II, the carrier aviation became a dominant platform in surface naval warfare. And then as aircraft carriers and the aircraft aboard them advanced technology, doctrine and procedures were gradually and then rapidly developed to fully exploit their combat potential. So by the end of World War II, the aircraft carrier had displaced the battleship as the primary naval surface combatant, and going forward, provided navies with kind of capabilities, particularly in terms of power projection, that they'd never before been considered. And this is really disruptive for everything. And what you see there in the picture on the right-hand side is that how navies, particularly the United States Navy, restructured themselves around this platform completely. So every element of what a naval force was disrupted gradually over time. Now, some may say that this is quite a high bar to set to assess disruption. But I think because we're in such a formative place right now, I think this is a kind of a good way to frame what these technologies that we're going to talk about can actually achieve. So what we did was we looked at, as I said, unmanned systems and maritime domain awareness. Now, in both these fields, there's been like significant levels of investment from both major and kind of smaller powers, and lots of kind of analytical excitement. So, in the context of unmanned vehicles, the concept of like scores of unmanned platforms working autonomously together in contested maritime zones is really attractive to navies and really exciting for analysts and journalists, but maybe the reality is a little bit different. And like the US DoD believes sometime in the future that unmanned systems will have the capacity to organically detect, track, recognize, target, counter, and engage enemy targets at sea, in the air, on the land. And so we can make a significant argument that these systems will have a lot of potential to create substantial warfighting effects at sea in the future, possibly even detached from human control. But nothing I've described here could be construed as truly disruptive to the exercise of sea power at the sharp end, certainly not in the creation of operational effect. Sorry. And it's also, I think, vital to remember that really big hurdles still exist. It's very important to remember that UAV technology is rapidly diffusing, and the entry barriers are lowering, and we're seeing lots of interesting uses of unmanned aerial vehicles and drones in different warfighting contexts. But the entry barriers for unmanned surface vehicles and unmanned underwater vehicles remain extremely high. There are lots of challenges. And just one, for example, is that any high technology system at sea without crews to carry out maintenance is extremely difficult to operate. So unmanned systems operating at significant distances from their bases for sustained periods of time will have to demonstrate a level of operational durability that really has never been seen before. And this is one of the many hurdles that will need to be overcome before we can kind of get to anywhere where unmanned systems are going to take on some of the roles that people have ascribed to them recently. This does not mean, as I said, that these systems have no utility, but rather it's going to take a lot of time for the technology to mature. As I said, remote control of UAV have already demonstrated utility in military operations, but it's going to take a lot more time for the naval equivalents to do the same, I would argue. Turning to maritime domain awareness, for those of you who don't know, MDA is a kind of necessary and critical input for all outputs of sea power. The goal of MDA is to achieve kind of persistent, resilient, and a real-time picture of the subsurface, surface, and air domains in any designated operational area, and it requires the ability to collect data from lots of different sensors and then interpret that data using AI-enabled computers, most likely, and in order to create an actionable operational picture. But in reality, surface and aerial MDA has undergone consistent, sustained innovation over a gradual and long period of time. So essentially, for the last 15 or 20 years, for major countries, the number of places where you can hide a surface ship has shrunk and continues to shrink. So as 4IR technologies become more prevalent, that is just going to continue to shrink. This is not disruptive, this is just sustaining the pattern that's gone on before. One area where we might see disruption is in the underwater environment, where we might see increasing levels of ability to detect submarines, but it's worth noting that there is a significant and large debate going on about this very question right now that is extremely difficult to have in the unclassified realm, because we just don't know what it actually is. But it's worth noticing that that is one area where disruption could actually occur. And then I think it's also worthy of analysis is that many of these MDA capabilities, sensor networks, processing facilities, C4ISR chains are not particularly survivable in peer-on-peer conflict. So an interesting question, and we'll talk about this a little bit for China, is what happens when we get into the warfight, how survivable are, many of these MDA systems ultimately is a very interesting question. So as I said, we then looked at the use of Baltic and the South China Sea to kind of look at these two questions. And in the Baltic, we took it from NATO's perspective, and definitely you could see that 4IR enabled MDA would certainly improve NATO's current ability to maintain an operational picture in the Baltic. This could theoretically reduce Russia's ability to carry out some sort of hybrid or a deniable attack, and certainly in the outfit of war would allow NATO to prosecute Russian assets much faster. Similarly, armed unmanned systems could rapidly destroy or deplete difficult to replace Russian offensive and defensive munitions, particularly in Kaliningrad. But the reality is such capabilities already exist in the form of long-range standoff precision weaponry, including sea and air-launched cruise missiles. So rather than adding a disruptive new string to NATO's bow, what they're actually doing is acting as a kind of force multiplier, complementing existing capabilities. And in the case of the South China Sea, Sarah, my colleague, particularly looked at China's desire to create a comprehensive MDA picture in order to maintain sea control, or conversely deny the US the use of the South China Sea at the same time. And she makes a convincing argument that they are developing these capabilities But as we talked about, as I just talked about, the caveat exists that persistent MDA may not be achievable in wartime due to the ability of the US to disrupt these sensor nodes, communication links, and data processing centers, essentially destroying the elements of the C4ISR chain that China is trying to construct at the moment. If China did manage to create a survivable persistent MDA capability that could maintain its links to its warfighting systems, this could be a disruptive game changer moving forward. But again, that's a huge if. And I think we are really at the beginning of this kind of discussion, and there are many, many questions still to answer. We identified that 4IR, or how 4IR affects the generation and operation of sea power, such in terms of manning, decision-making, strategic stability. These are all areas that are really worthy of further research, and we're only just scratching the surface. And I think it's just one other point that's worth noting is that our research in this article revealed that it's evident the US and China are far ahead of everybody else in the race of these technologies, and that while resource weaker states, including NATO allies, are much further behind. So even as technology diffuses, it is likely the existing order of power at sea will be maintained with China and the United States, quite a bit further ahead than everybody else. So I think, moving forward, I don't think we should look at 4IR technologies creating an immediate operational disruption at sea, rather a measured approach to the benefits, drawbacks, opportunities, and limitations of the 4IR is required. And for now, it is likely that naval fleets will continue to look and operate as they do right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Ian. Just a quick reminder that if you have any questions, that you please just feel free to enter them into the Q&A chat on your screens. We already have one question, but at this stage, we're turning over the, I'll be turning over the chair to my co-editor, Thomas Mankin, who will be leading the discussion. Over to you, Tom.
Great. Thank you, Joe. And thanks again to all of the organizers of today's event. And special thanks to all of the authors in this special issue. The Journal of Strategic Studies throughout its history has had a special place in publishing important articles on military innovation, and has played an important role in kind of pushing forward our understanding of military innovation. And this special issue really is an important extension of that long-term effort. And so I'd actually like to abuse my privilege by asking the first question of our panelists. And it really is about the challenges associated with peacetime innovation, and particularly the challenges of evaluating contemporary peacetime innovation, as each of you attempts to do. And that really has to do with the great degree of uncertainty that attends peacetime innovation, but then again, particularly contemporary peacetime innovation. Of course, if we look back historically, we have the luxury of knowing how things turned out, more or less, and then trying to figure out why. But here, each of you is evaluating contemporary developments and trying to think about how they may turn out. Now, I think a number of you touched on uncertainty and kind of key uncertainties in your presentations. I'd say most notably Ian just now. But I'd really like, and really I guess probably start back with Michael and kind of go in order. I'd like to ask you about the big uncertainties that attend your topic. So again, Michael, for just the overall revolution, what are the big uncertainties when it comes to Russia and China as innovators and their programs of innovation? What are the big uncertainties? And then Ian, you might want to delve a little bit more into uncertainties both on innovation and their impact on naval warfare. So Michael, first over to you.
Thank you, Tom. It's an excellent question, and it could be topic of another special issue. But from top of my head, these uncertainties come down to a couple of points. So, technological, I think what is really converging of all these presentations, you see technological innovation creates also, problems and challenges, from conceptualization to, into implementation, right? So on one hand, this whole experimentation phase in a peacetime that we are going on creates these technological uncertainties really with regard to the direction, character, and impact of warfare in the future. And here, the problems that the technologies create, are comprehensively on a scale, from strategic all the way to tactical levels, right? So there's a whole debate about, the governance of these technologies. How are we going to embed ethical principles? Are we going to, manage, the diffusion of these technologies from the government's perspective, all the way to the operational level, whether the use of these technologies at operational level will, mean that they will be used more frequently in combat because, the risk and dangers for humans are less. So will that actually endanger strategic stability, if you will, right? By, having the propensity, of using unmanned systems, robot versus robot. And then those goes down also the uncertainties at the tactical level. Can you actually really rely on these technologies, and what are the countermeasures? So when you study the revolutions on military affairs in the past, you see the persistent pattern of technological innovation, challenge, and adaptation. And I think this also is reflected in this sixth RMA wave, if you will. So you have all these new technologies coming online, and there is that factor of the response, whether it's the offsets versus offset on the great powers, but also how small states and middle powers can be also part of that technological competition. So these uncertainties are reflected at every possible level. And it is important not to underestimate or overestimate the impact of these technologies. But what I would also like to basically mention is that, again, we are in a phase of experimentation, and it is very, to what degree these technologies, are being reflected actual combat situation. You see, places like Syria, where the Russians are testing these technologies. You see sort of a little bit of experimentation in combat, but we have not really seen, a sort of a major, thank God, a major sort of a conflict where these technologies are being reflected. So there is strategic uncertainty, operational uncertainty, and I think it comes down to this technological competition. It's about that institutional agility at the end. Really, which organization will have the resources, the intellectual capacity to absorb these new technologies and come up with, innovative ways and means to use them. And that comes down to organizational agility, institutional agility, really to absorb new ideas and really sort of, change the military or organization. So bottom line, technologies are important, but they create new challenges, and it comes down to the organizational, institutional factors and to actually exploit them.
Katarzyna?
Thank you. Yes, very good question indeed. And I think the answer that Michael has provided is very much also could be applied to the Russian case. But I would also add the number of uncertainties is huge. In the case of Russia is also the domestic circumstances and not least constraints, which I mentioned very briefly in my presentation, which is of course related to the economic foundations of the programs and uncertainties related to resource allocations that the Russian armed forces are struggling with. I mentioned the educational trends, which also Russians, pointing out that are problematic. How can they manage to get the brains to work on the military application and also not to lose them in the civilian sector? which they try to solve pragmatically, as I mentioned in this discussing the innovation model in Russia. I think the uncertainty is also related to the also domestically how Russia will be reading and misreading the developments within this with the defense innovation on the side of their Russian perceived and actual competitors, and how this may impact the choices that Russia will make and priorities that Russia will make. There are a number also problems related, so the limitations that Russia struggles with and tries to solve pragmatically, I think it may also impact the choices. And so either though Russia has been copying a lot from the programs, in particular in the United States, I don't think we can just take for granted that Russia will continue mirroring what is going on in the United States and maybe also farther ahead in China. But also because of the limitation, Russia may arrive at solutions that will have to be pragmatic and maybe will be different in unexpected ways. Of course, by the definition, breakthrough technologies, this development may be non-linear, and occurrence of some impactful breakthrough also in Russia cannot be fully excluded. So I think this is also the uncertainty related to that development. I think Michael has very well sort of portrayed the broader scope for that. Yeah, I think I will stop here. Thank you.
Elsa?
And that's a great question, and I will try to provide a theoretical answer to some extent, and would welcome any thoughts on whether this is a reasonable framing of it. So I think the puzzle we're seeing, given this level of uncertainty, is why are militaries placing the bets that they're placing? Given that it is too early to prove or verify that AI will be the key to victory, and yet we see a lot of investment, at least relatively speaking, and relative consensus around it. In some cases, the discourse or the apparent agreement among militaries that these are these strategic technologies could be characterized as premature. And I think beyond some of the excitement with good reason about AI, another response could be, well, this is essentially just data science, and if you don't have the right data, then you won't get the right outcome. And of all of the potential domains of applications for AI, warfare is the worst or the least promising relative to a lot of the civilian and commercial use cases we're seeing, that where there is better data and lesser risks should things go awry. And certainly we've seen accidents and incidents with self-driving vehicles and otherwise. So perhaps the framing of the issue of uncertainty could be why, despite the uncertainty with these technologies and under peacetime conditions in which we are not seeing actual great power conflict, thankfully, in terms of contemporary operations, why is there still this relative agreement among militaries that this is the direction or that this is the future of warfare? And perhaps an alternative expectation could have been we would have seen more hedging by militaries, more of a sort of Bayesian approach of updating as there is more information coming out. And this, for instance, some of the skepticism about the impact of quantum cryptography and sort of whether it truly will provide an advantage relative to classical techniques, or some of the skepticism at times about quantum computing and sort of the time frame at which it will start to become relevant operationally could be a counterexample there. And I would argue, and I am perhaps arguing in my dissertation, that we're seeing a heuristic that militaries use to try to make decisions with this uncertainty, and to some extent that is emulation. And again, a concept with a long history in the military innovation literature, that militaries are copying each other across borders because they're fearful of disadvantage. But I would add perhaps a constructivist interpretation or framing, that there is a degree to which the idea of these technologies as strategic is being constructed or developed or becoming the subject of consensus based on some of the signaling and interactions sort of within and across epistemic communities in militaries that are trying to trying to develop a concept or vision of future victory. And I think this also highlights perhaps another theory or another framing, the importance of ideas, imagined battlefields, the sort of future of warfare as militaries envision it. And I think the role of ideas and imagination, perhaps futurism, become all the more critical in peacetime when ideas may have more salience and than sort of realities, because there is no mechanism to verify. And I think this also highlights sort of the role of entrepreneurs, one might say, or evangelists of certain ideas in promoting innovation in certain directions. There's been a question raised, for instance, who would be the Admiral Rickover for artificial intelligence in the U.S. Navy, or sort of who will be the leaders within organizations who sort of have the drive to overcome the inertia of bureaucracy that might otherwise impede implementation, and raise the question as well of who would sort of be the leaders in the pursuit of AI in the Chinese and Russian militaries, and how much do sort of personalities start to drive change within organizations relative to bureaucracy and different levels of openness to change across organizations. So I think, guess that would be my attempt to perhaps raise more questions in response to a very timely question. And I think we can start to sort of look, as the framing of the issue has highlighted, sort of looking at these trends in historical perspective, and what are the dynamics we're seeing emerge, and how are militaries trying to learn without fighting, so to speak, whether that is study or wargaming or training and exercises that are trying to start to test some of these ideas.
Great. Thanks, Elsa. I mean, Ian, you addressed this somewhat in your presentation. Is there anything further you'd like to weigh in on?
I think it's just worth emphasizing. I think in the naval environment, I think we are already in a large area of uncertainty, or time of uncertainty, because the idea of fighting peer on peer, or the kind of maybe theoretically closer view of becoming involved in warfare at sea is something that we just don't know what that is going to look like. And certainly, first mover, first strike advantage, will that be increased or decreased because of some of these technologies that are coming in, is a significant uncertainty that we're going to have to address. Secondly, because some would argue that naval warfare is going to be very short and very sharp, that there's not going to be, now there's arguments over that, but it's one way of looking at it, that there's not going to be time to iron out a lot of the problems that traditionally it takes a long time for militaries to operationally figure out these things when they've been introduced. So you need to change doctrines, procedures once you've introduced these, and we've seen this for the last 20 years as NATO or the US has perfected, close operational support and all of these different things. It takes time to do this, but at sea, if war does break out, we're just not maybe going to have the time to perfect. So the uncertainty will be, what will work and what will not. And we're going to hope that the things that will work are going to work, essentially. So I think that's two of the things we have to look into. And then I think the third uncertainty, which I didn't address in the paper, is the impact on interoperability and alliances. And when you have, we've talked about militaries here, the Chinese and the US, and to a lesser extent the Russians, but virtually every other military is far, far behind. And how does NATO, for example, or US allies in Asia maintain any level of interoperability as the US more closely engages with some of these concepts, is something that is worthy of significant investigation, and certainly is an element of uncertainty, I think, in many capitals across the world at the moment.
Thanks, Ian. Well, look, it's a feature of good, rich scholarly discussion that it promotes and prompts a lot of questions. And we actually have, although we only have 10 minutes left for our session, we've got a half dozen questions. So what I will do, because they're addressed to different members of our panel, I will try to summarize them fairly rapidly, and then turn it back to the panel, actually in reverse order. So starting with Ian, to address whatever aspects they would like, within our remaining time. So first question we have is from Dick Bitzinger. It's actually aimed at or addressed to Katarzyna about the Russian innovation program and the economic limitations of the resources to deal with it. Do you believe that Russia can craft a long-term and across-the-board focus on transformative technologies and be able to continuously fund it? So that's one for you to consider. We have a question about the Russian Navy, so actually spanning a couple of the presentations. And what are the challenges of the Russian Navy in the sense of its strike capability, since it's essential in modern naval warfare, and yet the Russian Navy is shrinking and is aging in some ways. So how can the Russian Navy sustain its operation in its effort to maintain their active defense strategy in the face of these developments? We have a third question from Anit Mukherjee for Michael and perhaps others. New age technologies suggest that military organizations and especially defense ministries need to undertake changes to take advantage of such technological developments. What specific organizational changes are you suggesting or observing in different ministries of defense or other associated organizations? We have a question from Adam Svensson for anybody and for everybody. And it's generally, do you think the reality observed, that is what is implemented, ever lives up to the surrounding hype that you also witness? Or are there large gaps? And I think a couple of you have addressed that one way or another, but I think that would be good for some further comments. Question for Elsa. In the light of rapid naval modernization along with high technologization of the Chinese Navy in recent times, do you foresee domestic support for Japanese remilitarization with an offensive lens, lest they fall too far behind China in terms of AI military capabilities? And then finally, a question from Austin Wyatt. To what extent do you expect to see experimentation among those middle and minor powers as great powers continue to invest in these technologies? Do you think this will primarily occur in the technological sphere or in developing novel operational concepts? So a rich table for us to feast at in the remaining 7 minutes. But over to you first, Ian.
Okay, I think I'll take two, maybe three of the questions. This first question on the gaps question, I think I'm going to paraphrase Peter Roberts at RSIS, who talked about network-centric warfare, which was a concept of a few years ago. And he said, we've never lived up to the hype of that, but we're much better now than we were before. And I think in a lot of these things, what you see is that there is a kind of overarching operational concept. We never quite reach it, but generally we are a bit better or closer to that than we were before we started. But again, often it takes a lot longer to even get to that point that many people will predict, because these things take time. The second, I think the last question by Austin Wyatt is also very interesting, about middle and minor powers to continue to primarily occur in the technological sphere. A lot of that depends on their geostrategic location and how much money they have. So many middle and minor powers are just struggling to maintain their current forces or increase their operational level right now, which is extremely expensive and extremely difficult. So their capacity to be innovative is kind of smaller than it would be for larger powers. So they need to be really selective about what they're pursuing. And it's very difficult to develop novel operational concepts when you don't have the technology to go with it. I would say in a NATO context, NATO is beginning to look at these things a little bit more interest, I think, certainly publicly at least. Yeah, so there's the two answers to my question. I can push it on to the next person.
Thanks, Ian. Elsa?
Let's see, I would speak first to the question of hype, and I'd perhaps reframe the issue as, is hype bad or useful? I think there can be certainly a dynamic whereby there are reasons for concern that the level of hype and some of the discourse in media, for instance, the notion of an AI arms race and the sort of hyperbolic expectations of killer robots may engender fear, that, for instance, alienates companies and their engineers from being willing to work with militaries on this, and but has also provoked useful conversations and really critical issues around ethics. I think there's also a degree to which hype becomes interactive and drives investments by militaries fueled by anxieties about falling behind. And I think there also may be ways in which hype is detrimental to actual substantive operationalization of practical capabilities, as we've seen in sort of the past hype cycles that have generated AI winters relative to sort of phases of AI exuberance. I think when there's a gap between expectations and reality, or when there are, for instance, arguably hype can be a way for militaries to motivate investments in capabilities where it may otherwise be difficult to shift budgets or resources. But if there's an over-promising and under-delivering with different programs that may undercut support for their sustainment. So yeah, I think sort of interesting questions about the certainly gap between hype and reality, but the impact of hype will be interesting to observe as this plays out. And I guess on the question of Sino-Japanese rivalry, I will defer to experts on Japan, but just say that I think certainly Chinese capabilities and the way they may play out in the region, including, for instance, drones as an option for persistent presence in disputed waters and as a means to put pressure on other militaries, I think will certainly provoke concerns and perhaps exploration of feasible countermeasures, as well as tricky conversations of, for instance, if you have drones impinging upon or near Japanese airspace or in the vicinity of the Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, sort of what is a reasonable or proportionate response? If a drone were to be shot down in the East or South China Sea, sort of what kind of risk of escalation or sort of proportionality of could we expect to see from different militaries? And yeah, I think certainly, I'll defer to others in Japanese domestic politics, but I think the velocity and scope of Chinese military modernization, I think, is provoking many militaries in the region to explore their options on a number of fronts. And I think in response to the last question as well, I think middle and minor powers, even if they don't invest, will have options to procure and buy, especially as there are cheaper commercial technologies that provide some interesting capabilities as well going forward.
Great. Thanks, Elsa. Katarzyna?
Thank you. I will address the first the question from Richard. Yes, I think you are right. In general, there has been a lot of ad hoc focus when it comes to choice of the programs, primarily copied from the United States. There was actually an interesting confirmation also about that from the Russian authorities. The former head of GUNID. GUNID is the main directorate of research and technological support in the Russian MOD, which focuses on helping to coordinate, foster innovative research. It's relatively new. And he said, the former head of that, in 2014, that initially the Russian domestic industry created a number of robotic systems that turned out to be quite useless because they didn't take into account the needs of the Russian armed forces. So since then, they claim they have managed to establish cooperation and coordination with the commands to collect information on the requirements, on their needs in the Russian army. And they also, the representatives of the MOD, the GUNID the main directorate, they also take part in exercises and experimentation phase just to make sure that there is a line, that there is a good communication and less of this ad hoc focus on the various programs. But I think what is the economic part, I have talked about that quite a lot, and I think you asked what about, what will be after Putin. I think a number of these questions related to the Russian economy, resource, the structural problems in the Russian economic and political system, they will not go away with Putin, and they actually may be crippling over time. So this is a very big questions of uncertainty going further ahead. Another one is also, as I briefly presented, some of the extensive network that Russia has been creating and continues to create, the extensive, broad and dense centrally coordinated top-down network of various entities trying to cooperate together. So I also wonder to what extent actually they will be able to constitute a breeding ground for innovation, but also how they will be able to coordinate and maintain an overview of what is going on, because it's extremely vast network. And but still they attempt. There is, among others, also a way of collecting information both in Russia and abroad about the innovative, promising projects, which is collected, among others, by the Defense Management Center. So they have this sort of centralized catalog of what is going on, and they try to prioritize and try to strategize about it. But yes, I mean, there is a number of bumps ahead. I still would closely observe, Russia has shown also an ability, on the one hand, we have this oversized ambitions and rhetoric as also related to the international or directed at the international public. But then we also see a lot of pragmatism, creativity, flexibility, and again, the ability and willingness to take risk, which is, I think, important qualities in innovation. And so I would not completely discard, and I think we should definitely carefully watch what is going on in Russia in that field. And just briefly to touch upon the question on the Russian Navy, it's a very big topic. And yes, Russia has been struggling, especially when it comes to surface shipbuilding and large capital ships. But I'm not sure to what extent we are still beneficial, comparing the Russian Navy to its Soviet equivalent. The Russian Navy has, to some extent, similar to us, but in general, it's a different reality. And also here, the tasks of the Russian Navy are quite pragmatic. It is, the global, for instance, presence is relatively limited, and they are very clear about it. Again, there are huge ambitions. We've heard about the ambitions for a number of years about Russia, creating second largest fleet in the world, which of course didn't happen. But so yes, there are problems in the shipbuilding industry. Russia has been struggling for a number of years, trying now to refurbish, modernize the older ships, Soviet ships, because they do not manage to build on time and for a reasonable price. And it just goes too slowly. So one of the, again, which shows also the pragmatism, and this is my last remark, Russia focuses on building smaller ships, so smaller corvettes and frigates that are cheaper and faster to build, but uses the armament where Russia has its strength, which is the missile technology. So long-range precision weapons, which are equipped, armed, the small ships, both submarines and surface ships, and this to some extent alleviate the problem with approaching targets. So this is just one example of that. Russia tries to find solutions which to some extent may work. Thank you.
Thanks. And Michael, back over to you for the last word.
Okay, thank you so much, Tom. A couple of the just very brief points on the organizational changes for defense ministries. So every defense ministry, whether it is in the US or or a small country, it's this paradoxical animal, because on one hand, defense ministries, they seek innovation, but at the same time, they are afraid of change, right? And so this paradox has been historically reflected, for many decades. So which defense ministry will have the more institutional agility and the willingness to take risk, it has probably more potential to exploit these technologies further. So some of the changes is, try to, outsource some of that, to, the innovation to private companies, but that also creates new vulnerabilities, right? So how you do the public-private partnerships, how you integrate with other organizations and academia, and sort of create these defense innovation ecosystems, which is a very fancy word, and leverage opportunities from that. And on the small states and naval powers, of course, they don't have the resources to pursue full-scale innovation, but they also have that nimble adaptability. Because they are smaller, they can try new things in different ways, and they can maybe be more adaptable and in a sense, trying to figure out things a little bit differently. So they have disadvantages, but also advantages. So I think if they figure it out to merge the technological and conceptual innovation within the flexible organizational framework, I think they have a potential to improve the traditional, geostrategic or military sort of limitations. So those are very, short answers. And again, on my end also, I wanted to thank everyone for joining us today, also for the participants. It's a great pleasure and honor to have both editors of the JSS here. And I really enjoyed working with all the authors on this issue. So thank you again.